Hey there, it's JG. I've been saving up all my gacha pulls for the Silver Ash Altar banner that we know is coming sometime soon, but then Hypergriff went and dropped this terrifying rattlesnake goddess and ruined all my plans. When I ran some initial numbers on Mantra, she looked pretty exceptional, so I decided Silver Ash can wait and rolled for her. It only took me about 60 pulls, which isn't bad. Today I'm going to tell you why I saw so much potential in her and decided she was a priority for my box. Mantra is a 6-star primal caster. Her primary role is a burst DPS. She brings resist ignoring elemental damage, which makes her particularly useful for enemies with both high defense and high res. She also brings substantial offensive and defensive support. The thing that jumped out to me was she gets all the strengths of elemental damage units but with none of their usual weaknesses. I did a short video on the elemental damage meta that you should watch if you're unfamiliar. Elemental units have the alluring prospect of elemental damage which ignores both defense and res, like true damage, but oftentimes it's difficult to actually capitalize on that elemental damage due to the difficulty of achieving its trigger conditions. Mantra upends this by being fully able to capitalize on elemental damage by herself, but still having powerful synergies with other elemental units. That's mostly thanks to her talents, which interact with the paralysis condition. Under normal circumstances, paralysis interrupts an enemy from making its next normal attack. An elemental burst of nervous impairment inflicts 3 stacks of paralysis, which will block the enemy's next 3 attacks. Mantra adds to that mechanic. Talent 1 causes enemies to take elemental damage when they make that failed attack. A maxed Mantra adds an average of 4,600 elemental damage across the 3 stacks of a nervous impairment burst, which is 77% more damage than that burst ordinarily inflicts. Talent 2 helps inflict more paralysis. She targets an incursion point close to her, and any enemy who enters from that point starts with 1 stack of paralysis. This means that without any nervous impairment units in your squad, she can still inflict a decent amount of piercing damage through her talents. Then we have her skill 3. Once again, this bypasses nervous impairment entirely and just directly inflicts paralysis stacks on any units in range. Those stacks will either block an enemy attack in the normal way and deal elemental damage via her talent 1, or explode due to her skill effect and deal elemental damage immediately. And by the way, while this skill is active, which is pretty often since it boasts an exceptional 50% uptime at Mastery 3, her base attack is substantially increased, which increases the damage her talent inflicts for paralysis stacks anywhere on the map. A full 3 stacks from a nervous impairment burst will inflict 17,000 elemental damage during her skill, or 390% more than it normally would. Mantra is able to fully exploit her elemental damage kit even if nobody on the squad inflicts any elemental injury. This is what I mean by having all the strengths of an elemental unit but none of its weaknesses. And one of those strengths of elemental units that we have to mention is synergy. Elemental units build off each other. The magnificent pairing here is Mantra with Tragodia. Tragodia's cat is exceptional at triggering nervous impairment bursts all over the map. A typical cat attack inflicts 10,000 arts damage on each target and enough nervous impairment to trigger a burst even on boss enemies, adding 6,000 elemental damage to that. Just having Mantra on the field increases the damage of the cat by a minimum of 28%, or 106% when her skill is active. All it requires is for the unit to attempt attacks so that it consumes the paralysis stacks. Tragodia was S-rank before. Mantra pumps him up a few notches, and deploying his cat in the middle of Mantra's skill range is like setting off an Originium bomb. These two make an insane team.
Mantra's S3 also synergizes with all kinds of other units. This skill text is really hard to comprehend, so I had to do a bunch of testing to be sure I had it right. Here's how it works. First, adding stacks. She adds 2 stacks of paralysis to all enemies within her range as soon as she triggers her skill. Anytime anyone else within her range activates a skill, it also adds 2 stacks of paralysis to every enemy within her range. However, this effect will only activate 3 times total across her skill duration. You can hit an unlimited number of enemies with each of those 3 activations, but after 3 skill activations, no more free paralysis. The burst effect of nervous impairment still works as usual, and still adds 3 stacks of paralysis. Second, there's the explosion effect. Anybody within her range with 3 or more stacks of paralysis will consume 1 stack and cause an explosion that inflicts a large amount of elemental damage. If they have 4 or more stacks, the first explosion happens immediately on receiving the paralysis, but the next explosion is a couple seconds later. The 3 activation limit means you can't proc it over and over on a boss, but since there's no limit to how many units it can hit at once, it can straight up delete swarms of enemies. The on-deploy skill of Executors works here, and so do auto skills and even toggle skills, but Battlefield devices do not. This skill also pairs extremely well with other nukers. We've all had that experience of stacking up our heavy hitters and waiting for a boss to get in range. Hit Mantra first, then 2 other nukers within range, and she'll add 23,000 piercing damage in just the first few seconds of her skill to every single unit within range.
And we haven't even talked about the defensive benefits here, because in addition to all the elemental damage you're dishing out, each stack of paralysis negates an enemy attack. Pop Mantra when the dangerous enemies get close, and not only do they die faster, they deal a lot less damage. Paralysis stacks don't time out, they last until consumed. So there's not even any subtlety to the timing. She also strips invisibility in her 18-tile target area, which I believe makes it the widest range invisibility counter, finally power creeping the last part of Silver Ash's kit that he was still the best at. Now is a good time to remind you to like and subscribe if you're enjoying my analysis. For the numbers nerds, here's a side-by-side comparison with another S-rank caster, Logos. Their S3s are fairly similar large attack ranges, big boosts to attack, and hit multiple targets. In terms of arts damage, Logos is strictly better, a bigger attack multiplier and hits 4 targets instead of 2. Plus, his talents directly amplify his arts damage. Against a full 4 targets with infinite HP and B+ res, Logos will deal 62,000 damage per target, or 248,000 damage total across his skill cycle. Mantra deals 55,000 per target, or 110,000 total. She's competitive for damage per target, but only hitting 44% of his total. So far, advantage Logos. But we haven't added any paralysis or elemental damage factors yet. If there are enough targets for Logos to hit 4 enemies on every attack, there are enough targets for Mantra to add a lot of paralysis stacks. 4 targets means 8 stacks of paralysis. That adds 40,000 to Mantra's total. Now she's winning for most damage to 1 target, and at 60% of his total damage.
But if you add just 1 other operator triggering a skill, you add 8 paralysis explosions. Now she's far ahead in single target damage and basically meets his total damage output. Plus, a huge chunk of that damage is front-loaded in the first few seconds of her skill. Add a second skill activation or more targets and she leaves him in the dust. And the difference only grows if you consider higher res enemies, because the bulk of her damage is elemental.
There are 2 situations where she can far outclass the competition even without tons of skill activations. The first is when res is high. That's the fundamental value proposition for elemental damage. With A+ res or higher, conventional wisdom says don't use a caster. But Mantra's paralysis damage is still at full effectiveness. The second is when dealing with swarms, because there's no limit on target count for her paralysis placement. She's good against single targets, but she's stupid good against hordes. This skill scales well with masteries. There's a 20% growth in attack, which benefits both the arts damage and her talent 1. The explosion damage increases by a whopping 54%. First skill activation drops from 20 seconds to 9, and uptime improves modestly from 47% to 50%. Now, how about her S2 and S1? These actually include nervous impairment damage to directly proc elemental bursts and add extra paralysis stacks that way. Like many elemental skills, they add nervous impairment based on damage dealt, which means that they scale poorly against high-res enemies. S3 is by far the most effective against high resistance because it can trigger elemental damage without having to trigger arts damage first. S1 is the AFK skill, a typical offensive recovery skill that spikes every few attacks. Unless AFK is really valuable to you, this one is very situational. Its main strength is that it's the best skill for consistently proccing nervous impairment bursts on a single target and maximizing the time it spends paralyzed. If that's your goal, it greatly benefits from masteries. At full power, a target with 39 res or less, which is the low end of B rank, will get 3 paralysis stacks every 19 seconds, and a target with 59 res, A rank, will get those 3 stacks every 24 seconds. You could potentially soft lock a slow attacker with that, but that's very situational, and the damage drops off fast if you're not focusing fire on a single target to produce bursts. I wouldn't really recommend using or mastering this skill. S2 turns her into a fast chain caster with elemental damage. It's an extremely viable second skill. It hits fast and can rack up nervous impairment quickly on multiple targets. With 4 big targets in range, it likely triggers 2 bursts on the primary target and 1 on all the others inside of its 25 seconds. That means 6,000 burst damage on each of them, another 4,600 from the impact of her talent 1, and around 11,000 bonus elemental damage from attacking enemies under a burst effect. If you have other elemental units in the squad that synergize with nervous impairment, this skill can help everybody proc to their full potential. S2 and S3 shine in completely different contexts, which is what makes them both so viable. When she's fighting solo, S2 outperforms S3 in most contexts, but S3 isn't meant for fighting solo. It's meant to shine when your whole team goes Nova against a boss. S2 behaves like a traditional caster skill. It's good where casters are good, but it's bad where casters are bad. S3 is good where casters are bad. S2 is just another caster skill, albeit a very good one, but S3 is something totally unique. Mantra's standout strength is the ability to bring elemental damage against enemies that are otherwise difficult to damage. That uniqueness is what makes Mantra an interesting add to your team, even for experienced players. Outside of that unique niche, S2 is probably the better default. If you decide you like S2, it benefits from masteries. The art's damage per hit increases by 14%, and M3 adds another 14% through a further boost to attack speed. M2 increases the nervous impairment damage from 15% to 18%, which reduces the art's damage required to reach a burst substantially. That means more elemental bursts faster. All in all, Mantra is a fearsome beast. She's a good entry point into the elemental meta because she's great even if you don't have any other elemental units. Hypergriff is actively developing the elemental meta, so her synergies should only improve with time. Her unblockable elemental damage is clutch in a few key contexts, but she doesn't fade in everyday use like some other operators I could mention. And while she brings a rich kit with a lot of strategic depth, she's not confusing to use, which is more than I can say about some other units we're expecting to see soon. Evaluate whether she has things that your box needs, but my assessment is that she's very worth picking up. Please remember to like and subscribe and let me know in the comments if you think I missed anything important in the analysis. See you next time.